Welcome to Now Serving a Site of Therapy, a client's introductory guide into the therapeutic world. Be sure to follow, subscribe, and comment on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. To schedule a therapy appointment, call us at 650-223-5065. For more information on this and other related topics, check out our blog at izzotherapy.com, where you can also contact us through our website. I'm your host, Dalton Huckaby, a licensed marriage and family therapist, and I'm grateful you've joined me. Welcome to this week's episode of Now Serving a Site of Therapy, a client's introductory guide into the therapeutic world. Today, we are joined by Lindsey Smith, who is an associate marriage and family therapist with 3 years of clinical experience, offering compassion, insight into complexities of grief and loss. She helps listeners understand that grief is nonlinear, deeply personal, and something we learn to live with rather than get over. Lindsey explores how grief shows up in the body, the mind, and our relationships, emphasizing grounding and self-awareness as essential tools for healing. Through her conversations, she empowers people to honor their unique grief journey, build supportive coping practices, and carry their grief with greater gentleness and resilience. Welcome, Lindsey, to this week's of the episode.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you joining and talking about this very important topic.
Happy to join. I think a lot of people ask about this and don't talk about it enough. So I'm happy to be here and kind of help explain.
Sweet. Awesome. So as we kind of get into things, right, we always like to define what we're talking about, right? And if you just Google, right, what the definition of grief, right? All it really says online is deep sorrow, right? And so, and then in this, I'm going to make a plug for this resource, right? The Grief Recovery Handbook, right? And it is by John James and the Russell Friedman. And so in here, what I really like the description of grief that they spell out in here. And they say, grief is the conflicting feelings caused by the end of change or in a change in a familiar pattern or behavior. In this sense, right, then we can see that it's not just about external events, right? Like, or such as like death or life transition or a breakup, right? That people might typically think around grief, but it also can relate to like our own internal growth processes as we like change in our behavior and our mindset. And that thought of grieving our younger selves, right, as part of that inner child work, like comes to mind for me here. So we can see like it really can span, like grief and loss might show up in ways that people don't even imagine. Like, oh, that's grief and loss. Yes, it is.
Exactly. And I explain that to clients and sometimes even my family that every moment that we live, we are grieving something, whether it's the loss of time, the charge on my battery phone. There's so many things, but we've become so accustomed to it that we don't notice those smaller losses, which makes the more intense ones much larger.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like you said, right. Showing up in even the smallest of ways that we may not even recognize. And so what would you kind of hand the mic over to you now? Like, what would you want to start off by saying in our discussion today around grief and loss?
Yeah, I think it would be important to set a foundation before we really get into it to say grief really isn't something that you just get over. It's something that you really learn to live with, and it changes shape over time. So it's not just sadness, which is what a lot of people believe. It's more physical, emotional, cognitive, it's relational, it's spiritual. It has so many different forms. And so when somebody is experiencing loss, they may think, oh, well, I'm not doing it properly because it doesn't look like what I think it's supposed to look like.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the myths here in a little bit, right? But that could be part of the myth, right? Is what, or maybe even culturally what they've learned too, right? There could be some cultural components of it as well.
Exactly. Yeah. think it's also important to talk about how grief lives in the body. So when we think about somatic practices, right, in our bodies, feeling grounded is something that we talk about a lot, but being grounded helps people to feel less overwhelmed and more anchored in what they're doing. So before processing grief, people need to feel safe and grounded, which can start with gentle grounding, body awareness exercises. Those you can find on YouTube in a pinch, but therapists usually have an extensive background on somatic practices, which is why I always recommend checking that out with your provider and saying, hey, this is what I'm experiencing. I'm acknowledging that grief is showing up physically for me. I feel tightness, it's heavy, it's dense, it's numbing, it feels restless, I'm consistently fatigued. And in that process, a clinician would be able to say, okay, let's go step by step on focusing on what does it look like and feel like to be grounded.
Yeah, and people might often hear like grounding exercises, right? And again, it's with a specific intention and purpose, right? And like you said, it seems to me that when we do go through experiences around grief, and especially if it's kind of like complex or traumatic, right, there might be this separation between mind and body. So even all the more importance of why to start with that grounding process to kind of make that mind body connection and kind of encourage increasing that awareness around, hey, what's going on for me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good way of putting it. I think it's also important to address the fact in what you said in the introduction, grief is nonlinear. It's unpredictable and it's deeply personal. So many people can feel severely isolated in their grief. And I think that's a very natural response for most people. It's one of the most healing experiences, and realizing that these responses are normal, but in addressing that, saying, okay, what do I need?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think even kind of we usually kind of save takeaways till the end, right? But I what's coming to mind for me is that just re-emphasizing the idea that however your grief process looks like it's okay, like whatever it is.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
if we're judging ourselves around it, then that's something to look at, right? That could be part of the process. But can you help me to understand, in case people aren't aware, like growth is nonlinear. Like, what does that mean, and what does that look like?
Yeah. So this concept of grief being nonlinear, I wanted to discuss those typical stages of grief that everyone quickly rushes to. It's kind
I'm
of that,
so glad you're going to make the distinguishment here.
yeah, and it's interesting because you see over time on social media, somebody says there's 5 stages to grief, there's 7, there's 9. And it even further confuses people to think, wow, if I'm grieving and I'm not doing these explicit stages, they feel like they're doing it wrong. But as it states, even in that grief recovery handbook, which I absolutely love and highly recommend, the original research that was done on the stages of grief was done by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. She was actually studying the impact of someone who received a terminal illness diagnosis, and her research was set to find out how an individual deals with the grief of dying themselves, not necessarily losing someone else. And so I think people can misconstrue a lot of the information that's out there. And Kubler-Ross even later discredited her own research around grief in this way and urged people to see it from that nonlinear lens. But people saw the simplicity of these stages and just ran with it. And I think that's what people really stick to now.
Yeah, and I'm glad we're bringing this up because it kind of debunks the myth, right? Like you said, it's like, okay, well, first of all, it gives us a little bit more relaxed kind of freedom to like know, like, hey, it doesn't necessarily have to look this way. But yeah, like you said, like her study was based on like end of life stuff for personal, right?
Yeah.
And like, yeah, some of it might have some carryover, and there are other ways of looking at it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how one person grieves is not how another will. And we see that a lot too when looking at family dynamics when experiencing loss. Someone may say, well, my mom is feeling this, but I'm feeling this. And this person's feeling something else. And we're all in different places. We don't know what we're doing.
That's such a good and an important part, Lindsay. The part about thinking if a family is grieving, right? And especially if you have young ones kind of like looking up to how their parents are modeling how they're grieving, right? Like the fact that to give that message that, hey, however you grieve might be different than me, and that's okay.
Mhm.
And can we support each other with wherever we're at?
Exactly. It's meeting someone where they are, which is kind of my golden rule, if you will.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep. And so if that can be kind of like considered like debunking a myth, right? Like it has to go in particular stages. Like, no, it doesn't,
Yeah.
right? Great to clarify that. And I'd like to kind of take a moment to kind of go through some information. What about some other myths that
Mhm.
people might have, be misled around their grieving process?
Oh, yeah. I always hear that grief has a certain period of time. And the way that I like to explain it is sort of like there's a box, and in that box, it describes us. There's a circle, and that's the grief. And so when a loss first occurs, it's going to be large. It's going to take up all the space in that box. Over time and with assistance and support is one of the big things that people don't do because of the isolating tendencies. But over time, we really learn to use our tools, use our support. And that grief, while it never goes away, there's no certain amount of time, it sticks with us. And so I've had people even come into therapy and say, I want to be healed from this in 3 months, or I don't want to be crying over my dad's death in 6 months or a year, or whatever it may be. And to that, I even give them a little chuckle because I realize, that's a great goal, but is it realistic? And oftentimes, because grief is a taboo and people don't talk about it enough, they think, yeah, I could put a time on this, I could set a goal, and it'll all be over with.
Yeah, and something that's coming to mind for me, and I'm actually kind of getting goosebumps a little bit around it, which usually means I'm kind of onto something here, right? When I get goosebumps, is that from a cultural, at least from like an American cultural standpoint, like what it seems to me is that we're so like outwardly driven,
Mhm.
right? By trying to succeed at this because of trying to keep up with other people, right? Or trying to think of how are things looking on the outside of my life, right? And when grief happens, a lot of that's like gets reassessed
Mhm.
because we're trying to deal with grief in again whatever way it comes up. But if we keep on getting distracted by this outside stuff, right, it doesn't afford us the opportunity to be able to just be with ourselves,
Mhm.
which is really important. And it seems to me that if we are challenged to be with ourselves in a compassionate way during this vulnerable and sensitive time,
Mhm.
and it goes unprocessed, to your point, it can linger and affect our functioning in relationships down the road.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you bring that up, Dalton, because something that I've noticed a lot more in our society is we live in a fast-paced society. We are expected to produce and perform and to always be doing something productive. Otherwise, we feel like we're not valuable or people might see us as useless. And so that mindset also goes into grief in, well, I only get 2 days of bereavement time and then I got to go back to work and pretend nothing happened. Or
Right?
how can I rush through this process because I have kids, I have to take care of this person, I have to go do these things, these obligations. And it's so high stress that people don't take that time to challenge themselves and just sit in it because it's uncomfortable and they don't find time.
Absolutely. Or they may not even know how to be with themselves in that time. So it's almost sometimes easier to be distracted and thinking, oh, I need to go be distracted by the to-do list, right? Because that might seem easier than to like be with ourselves and our own
Yeah,
grief.
exactly. Yes. I think another big myth that I do see is somebody postponing or avoiding therapy after a loss because it's too fresh or it's too much right now. They're not ready. And so I'll use the analogy, well, if you broke your leg, are you going to stay home and just deal with the pain because it's too fresh and it's too much? Or will you go see a professional for help? And oftentimes people will smile and they'll say, yeah, I would go to the hospital. I would go seek consultation from a professional. So when we are practicing avoidance in that way, yeah, it's okay for you to assess yourself and say, I might not be ready, but also on the backhand, we need to consider, am I avoiding processing this?
Yeah, that's a great analogy, right? Because then what happens if you don't get the broken leg assessed, right? It's going to
Mhm.
impact the way you walk in the future, right?
Yes,
Literally just what we're saying. It's going to
yes,
impact you down the road.
exactly. Yeah.
I kind of wanted to kind of expand a little bit on that part around, like you said, people with the internalizing tendencies, right? Or the
Mhm.
way people might even perceive grief, right? People might have this idea of like, oh, I got to be alone, and it's got to be sad, and I'm in my field, whatever it is, like, or a bit more reserved, right? And it doesn't have to be that way. It can be loud and messy
Mhm.
and whatever, right? Again, there is no wrong way.
Mhm.
And because I remember like my dad and my brother died like 3 weeks apart,
Mhm.
several years ago now. But I remember like I was driving down the freeway and like I had to pull over at one point just because
Mhm.
the tears were coming, right? And then at another point, like I was in the grocery store going with my shopping cart, and then all of a sudden grief comes over. So it can really like that's the that might be something to kind of acknowledge too, is like it really can come up at any time.
Yeah.
And if we're not aware of it, like you said, if we don't have that mind body connection, we might not be aware of it, right? And then we're kind of walking around grumpy, upset, or whatever. I was like, hey, what's going on? It's like, oh, I didn't know I have this unresolved grief going along with me. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And so, but if we do have that mind body connection, we can be aware of what's coming up for us. Then we can like try to be with ourselves in this compassionate way, like we were talking about. And I agree with you, like that social support is huge, right? Again, people might tend to want to do that on their own, grieve on their own, and that's okay too. And yet, at the same time, at some point in the process, having that support system really help in the healing process.
Yeah. And I do have a situation I'd like to share myself. I did lose my father earlier this year in February, and I was one of those people that thought, I don't need to seek therapy right now. I'm a therapist. I know how to deal with this, right?
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
And I postponed it. I postponed it. I tried to use some tools of my own, but I was sitting in it and it wasn't working. And so that anger built up, that grief built up. I actually developed an autoimmune disease just from holding on to it and such high cortisol levels from not dealing with it.
Oh, wow. Huh.
So
Wow.
it has impacted me. It hurt my back. I wasn't able to stand or sit for about 3 months this year, just out of severe pain. And
That's a long time.
it was. I have this futon back here, and I was doing sessions on my futon and I made it work. But, it really sets the tone for this understanding that you can know the ins and outs of grief. You can be that person that others go to, the expert, if you will, And it can still happen to you. When it does, it's really devastating. And like I say again, numb at that first beginning stage. Well, at that point, thinking, oh, I'm a professional, I don't need to go get help. It's really not helpful for you. So if ever somebody is experiencing a loss, it doesn't have to be the death of someone. It could be quite literally any loss. Sit with it, deal with it. Although it feels nasty, it is so important because our mental health and our physical health literally are the same thing, and they go hand in hand.
Absolutely, yeah. So when you say, right, again, that this reference to the body keeps the score comes up over and over and time again. I can't tell you how many times in our podcast episodes we keep referring to it. But yeah, to your point, right? It lives in our body, and you just described an example of how it can, have an impact in that way. I mean, since February, like you haven't even hit the 1 year mark. It's still pretty new, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm just kind of curious, like again, like when you say, okay, yes, we can be with our clients, and sometimes we are we are clients too, right? We are clients too. And so but when you're working with clients, it's like you have some like emotional regulation and coping tools, right? But I was just kind of curious, which ones did you find were important for you to kind of like lean on during these past few months, several months for yourself? Yeah.
If I could name 3 of them, top 3, I would say writing letters. That was pivotal because
Fantastic idea.
of, well, I can't talk to him. And these conversations were left unfinished. And once I was able to find a grief therapist, she recommended to me, write him a letter every time you think of him. Tell him what you're thinking. Update him on what's going on. Ozzy Osbourne died this year, and he loved Black Sabbath. And so I wrote him a
Oh,
letter.
really? I was there at the, I think I told you, right? I was there at the Ozzy tribute. Yeah. Yeah.
Once in a lifetime opportunity. I'm a little jealous.
Yeah, definitely. I understood the severity of the of the situation when I was buying the ticket and going. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. So letter writing was incredible. I would say this technique, when we go back to feeling grounded and being aware of our bodies, it's a full body scan. I'm sure you've seen these, Dalton, where even on YouTube, you put in your headphones, you're in a comfortable position, maybe laying down, and the narrator will speak in a way that's so soft, it gives you those ASMR tingles, but they're going and discussing the top of your head all the way down. So you're bringing full awareness to your body. And in that, my takeaway, which isn't necessarily part of those videos, but what I would do in addition is say, what hurts? Okay, we're at my stomach. There's a pit. What is that? Okay, we're at my heart. My heart aches. What is that? And then processing in my sessions with my own therapist and writing about them in a journal, I would say that's the second thing that severely helped. The last thing would mostly be grief rituals. So what my family and I will do is on those holidays, those special occasions, or even those mini milestones, those things that maybe we take for granted, we don't celebrate frequently, like getting through a week or making it home safe from a long drive, getting to spend the holidays with family, whatever it may be, just being able to recognize and acknowledge them in those ways. And it's around Christmas time now. So I was talking to my sister about an hour ago. We were processing my father's passing, and she sent me something that said, how do you celebrate your loved ones around Christmas time? And so I sent her a video of my Christmas tree, which has pictures of all of my family members who have passed. and ornaments that they've given me and things in that way. So it's not a clean girl aesthetic Christmas tree by any means, but it's meaningful. And so in those ways, I can honor them. That's part of my grief ritual. And it's not just Christmas, it could be anything.
Yeah, I love that part of honoring, right? That was something I leaned into, was how can I honor them in this specific way? I think
Mhm.
when my dad died, I made a homemade chili, right?
Mhm.
So now whenever I make a chili, I was like, okay, this is for you, Dad, right? And yeah, I mean, it sounds like you were really close with him. Like you said, even these little things of like, oh man, I had a rough week. I could wish I could just be there and talk with him, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so not only are we grieving their death, but we're also grieving that part of us that know that there's a part of us that would want to be able to share these certain things with them.
Mhm.
And so we're also kind of grieving that part as well. Again, like we said, it's not just external stuff, it can be internal too.
Mhm. And if we're looking at parts work, which is my favorite, I think
Same.
we can also see this little tiny part that I myself have identified, and this might not be the case for others, but this idea that we're also grieving the loss of what could have been. You know,
Yes,
what would they
absolutely.
do in their old age? What hobbies would they have? What would they say? I'm looking back at my life and I achieved these things. One day I hope to get married, my wedding day. These kind of things that come up, and you think, I have the loss of that. That's another big piece that I think people don't want to dig that deep under the surface. But after some time, I say, no, we're digging. Here's a shovel.
Absolutely. You're so right on cue there, Lindsay. Absolutely. Yeah. And people may not even realize, again, they might not even realize that that might be part of the grief process, right? Until it gets named.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think part of in the therapeutic process is just naming it
Mhm.
can be huge.
Yeah. I love that.
Be sure to tune in next week as we continue our discussion with Lindsay around grief and loss and explore support systems, processing triggers and memories, befriending grief, and creating your own grief kit.